Pawn e2 to e4. Pawn e7 to e6. Pawn d2 to d4. Pawn d7 to d5. Knight b1 to d2. Pawn b7 to b6. Bishop f1 to b5, check. Pawn c7 to c6. Bishop b5 to e2. Knight g8 to f6. Pawn f2 to f3. Pawn d5 takes e4. Knight d2 takes e4. Knight b8 to d7. Pawn c2 to c4. Bishop f8 to b4, check. Bishop c1 to d2. Pawn a7 to a5. Knight g1 to h3. Castle kingside. Castle kingside. Bishop b4 takes d2. Queen d1 takes d2. Pawn e6 to e5. Knight e4 takes f6, check. Knight d7 takes f6. Rook f1 to d1. Bishop c8 takes h3. Pawn g2 takes h3. Queen d8 takes d4, check. Queen d2 takes d4. Pawn e5 takes d4. Rook d1 takes d4. Rook a8 to d8. Rook a1 to d1. Rook d8 takes d4. Rook d1 takes d4. Rook f8 to e8. King g1 to f2. Pawn c6 to c5. Rook d4 to d6. Rook e8 to e6. Rook d6 to d8, check. Rook e6 to e8. Rook d8 takes e8, check. Knight f6 takes e8. King f2 to e3. Knight e8 to d6. Pawn f3 to f4. Pawn f7 to f5. Pawn h3 to h4. King g8 to f7. Pawn h2 to h3. King f7 to e6. Bishop e2 to d3. Pawn a5 to a4. Pawn h4 to h5. King e6 to f6. Pawn h3 to h4. King f6 to e6. King e3 to f3. King e6 to f6. King f3 to e3. King f6 to e6. King e3 to f3. King e6 to f6. King f3 to e3. The game is a draw.